Okay, well, hello everyone. I am Laura Parker from Trenton Peak Archaeology, if you've never met me before. Unfortunately, it's not called Trenton Peak Archaeology anymore. We have now changed to York Archaeology and in brackets Nottingham, because we are a part of the York Archaeological Trust, and it is in the past few months when they've decided that we should all be rebranded and called one collective name of York Archaeology. But obviously, because we're still in Nottingham, we still then get in brackets Nottingham. So now we are Yan rather than TPA. I'm still on the Trenton Peak side of the fence. When the revolution comes, I'm sure we'll put the Trenton Peak sign back up on the walls. But at the moment, yeah, we're York Archaeology, Nottingham. So I'm about to talk to you on, it says recent excavations at Nottingham Castle. Obviously, it's been a while now since the excavations have been completed, but it's just to give you a general overview of what we found, and hopefully it's all of interest to you. First of all, though, let's check we're all on the same hymn sheet. Is this Nottingham Castle? No, that is not Nottingham Castle. That is a ducal palace. And throughout this presentation, I'm going to try and remember to say either the castle when I'm talking about the actual castle, or the ducal palace, which is the building which you see in front of you when I talk about that. The castle would have looked something like this in around 1485. So from the right hand side of the screen, you can see the upper bailey with quite a tall tower in it. In between the upper bailey and the middle bailey on the left, you've got a large defensive ditch, which would have had some kind of a walkway, drawbridge, or solid stone structure to get from one side of the main bailey complex to the other. On the left is the middle bailey. That's where you can see a chapel in the middle, and you've got a large complex, a large suite of apartments right on the far left, and a couple of quite large imposing towers. And then at the back of the picture, you've got the outer bailey, and you can see the gatehouse as it stands today, just to the top of the picture. There would have also been a northern bailey. This would have been to the left of the picture, out of the picture. And it's the northern bailey where the standard was raised by Charles I to start the Civil War in the 17th century. The northern bailey is no longer a part of the castle complex as it is today. Unfortunately, it has been built on. So if you do want to go and see Standard Hill, where Charles I raised his standard, it is covered by office blocks and flats. But there is a plaque if you're very interested. So before the castle, a small overview. We have had a bit of activity, a bit of archaeology done in Brewhouse Yard and also further along the Lean Valley. And from these excavations, we have found that there is a bit of prehistoric activity in this area. Now, it could be because it is such a large outcrop of sandstone, and therefore quite a good vantage point. And you've also got the rivers to utilise for trade, transport, and also to catch fish and things like that. While we were doing a bit of work in Brewhouse Yard itself, we did actually take a borehole through one of our excavations that we did, and we found that the River Lean has been around in that position for quite a long time, and we did actually start to find evidence of Iron Age pottery, some Mesolithic flints, which are from about 10,000 years ago. But also we were getting layers and radiocarbon dates from the early Bronze Age within the Brewhouse Yard area, which is around the same age as Stonehenge. So we know that people have been moving around in the Lean area and, you know, utilising it, and we've got flints and things to show that. But also we know that the Lean itself has been around in that place for a very long time. We also had a couple of early medieval finds during our excavations of both the castle area and Brewhouse Yard, one of which was an early grave cover from early 11th century. So you can see it on the left-hand side. We're not quite sure if anybody actually lived up on Castle Rock before the castle was built, but we do know that obviously Nottingham itself has an early medieval core even potentially some Viking origins as well. The blue dashed line on the map indicates where the Anglo-Saxon area of Nottingham is, and also the Viking centre. And then the red dashed line is the Norman extent of Nottingham town centre. You can just see at the bottom left corner, you can see where Brewhouse Yard is, and that's where the castle is as well. So we know that it is a little bit of a way from the Saxon centre of Nottingham, but there's nothing to say that they weren't utilising Castle Rock. So it's quite an interesting find. So moving into the Norman period, why build the castle? Well, you've got this massive sandstone outcrop. You can see for miles. You can control who is on the River Leen. You can also control who is going up and down the River Trent, because you can see the River Trent from there. So it's quite an imposing structure. You've also got across the Trent one of the most major and important crossings from north to south. So the River Trent Bridge was quite an important structure even back in 1066-67. The most original bridge is supposed to date from the 10th century. We do have remains of a later version of the Trent Bridge, which you can see near the Trent Bridge Inn pub, which is this top right hand picture. But obviously the version we've got now is a much more modern example of the Trent Bridge crossing. And it's so important because especially during William I's reign, the North were rebelling quite a lot. So it was actually quite an important route to get from the south into the north to quash any rebellions that were happening up there in the early years of William I's reign. So that's why he built the castle where it is. So what do we already know? We know that it was constructed under William the Conqueror. We know that Henry II replaced quite a lot of the timber defences with stone. So he was the one that built the main stone curtain walls around the outside, and he did further works later on. We know that more works were done in the 1270s as well. The stone keep was built around 1188. We've got the gate tower going up in the 14th century. We know that the Great Hall and Chapel that you saw in the Middle Bailey are from around the early 13th century. So a lot was going off in the early days. Henry II spent so much money on Nottingham Castle replacing all the stonework that he spent more money on it than he did building a brand new castle called Orford Castle, which I think is just on the Norfolk-Suffolk border. So you can imagine how much money he spent at Nottingham. It was quite an important place for the reasons already discussed, so it's easy to see why you'd do that. We know that it was besieged and recaptured by Richard I, because at one point supporters of Prince John, as he was at the time, held themselves up in the castle, and Richard I came back from crusade and had to besiege the castle to retake it for himself. You'd think that it would stand for quite a long time. You imagine the siege of Troy and things like this. Troy lasted apparently for 12 years under siege. Nottingham Castle lasted a grand total of 3 days, mainly because they saw Richard I's siege weapons and thought better of it. So they basically opened the gates to Richard I rather than face destruction. You've got also Roger Mortimer and Queen Isabella are captured and overthrown in 1330, and they are in Nottingham Castle when this happens. So you actually have a cave called Mortimer's Hole, where Edward III, Queen Isabella's son, led a troop of soldiers up into the castle through a secret passage, which is now known as Mortimer's Hole. But by this point, it is losing military significance. So the money that was spent on it in the 13th century, in the 12th century, it's not really up to scratch by the time you get into the 14th century. However, Edward IV and Richard III do spend a lot of money on it and do a lot of major rebuilding. Richard III builds a whole new suite of apartments, which you saw in the Middle Bailey in that earlier plan. And it was actually Richard III's favourite castle. He was actually at Nottingham Castle when he heard that Henry Tudor was on his way. So it is quite an important castle for Richard III. He also took his bed from Nottingham Castle with him on his journey to meet Henry Tudor at the Battle of Bosworth. So the last bed he ever slept in was his bed from Nottingham Castle, which is a pretty cool thing to know. So you've then got the period of the Tudors, where once again the castle isn't really used or looked after, all the way up to its destruction. None of the kings or queens ever really lived in it. They stayed from time to time, but didn't really live in it. So there was always a custodian, which is probably why there wasn't a lot of money spent on it during the Tudor period. So by the time you get to the Civil War, you've got Charles I raising his standard there. It's held by the parliamentarians, though, throughout the entirety of the Civil War under Colonel John Hutchinson. And after the Civil War, it was still considered such a formidable threat that it was slighted, it was destroyed. But it wasn't destroyed by the parliamentarians to stop it falling into Cavalier hands. It was actually destroyed by some parliamentarians alongside John Hutchinson to stop it being used by Oliver Cromwell and some of his more extreme followers. So that was the main reason. So after the monarchy is restored, the site is bought by William Cavendish, Duke of Newcastle, in 1661, and he builds a ducal palace, but he dies before it's finished. So again, it's never really properly lived in. So you've got a castle that's never really lived in and a ducal palace that's never really lived in. By the late 18th century, it's actually split up and rented out as apartments, but it's burnt down in 1830s riots. So you can see the picture on the right there of the fire. Apparently the fire was so hot that it melted the lead off the roof. The gardens, though, were then split up into allotments in the 19th century, whilst the palace itself was left as a ruin. And it wasn't until the 1870s that the palace was then restored and it formed a museum and art gallery, which is what it still is today. So that's a very brief history of the castle. There is a pop quiz later. I hope you're all listening. So, few previous archaeological excavations. The main one was uncovering Richard's Tower, which is in the Middle Bailey. And this is what you can still see as you walk around the castle grounds today. But up until the 70s, you couldn't actually see most of this. So here's just a few pictures from those excavations in the 70s, mainly to show you not only the depths of the curtain wall, which you can see in the top left corner, and the staircase that ran down the centre of Richard's Tower, which you can see on the right-hand side, but also the amazing health and safety of the man in the well in the bottom left, and also the fabulous hair and digging attire worn by the two people in the bottom right-hand corner. Fabulous hair. So why were we there? Well, they were building a new visitor centre, which is now there. These are early architects' drawings, so it doesn't necessarily look like this now, but it gives you a sense of what it was going to look like. I think it's more wood than glass now, right next to a nice stone gatehouse. I'll leave that up for you to decide whether you like it or not. There's also a new exhibition space, the Robin Hood Experience, in the courtyard. And I will show you where the courtyard is if you're not quite sure where it is. But if you do know the castle at all, you go through the main gate. And as you look up towards the Ducal Palace, there is a dark and imposing looking tunnel just to the bottom of it. That, if you go through that tunnel, leads you to the courtyard. And I'll show you that in a little bit. In 2016, we started off our works by doing a few test pits and boreholes. This was to determine a couple of things, to work out how much archaeology actually survived, and if we needed to then change the plan of how the visitor centre was going to look. Because if there was a lot of archaeology, then we had the opportunity to try and get them to change the plan, and the architect would have to rework the plan so that the archaeology underneath wouldn't be disturbed as much. We also used test pits and boreholes to determine the depth of the natural geology, because in some places the sandstone outcrop was up to 10 meters below ground level, and the builders needed to know that so that they knew what the foundations were going to look like. So we did need to do all of this work, because it all then helped to determine what the visitor centre and the new experience centre at the courtyard were going to look like in the end. So here's just a couple of pictures of a couple of the test pits. This is the service courtyard. So that big imposing tunnel that I was telling you about, that's the picture on the top left that you can see. Through there is just the courtyard where the staff used to park their cars, but now it's the new experience visitor centre. Underneath the courtyard is supposed to be this very large inner defensive ditch in between the Upper Bailey and the Middle Bailey. Drage in 1989 called it an uncompromisingly military barrier. Now try saying that after a couple of glasses of wine, it's quite hard. But that is where the defensive ditch would have sat. This picture is a reconstruction of what the castle may have looked like in the 11th century, so when it was originally built during the reign of William the Conqueror. So this is before Henry II has replaced quite a lot of the timber and earthworks with stone. So you can see there would have been some kind of a drawbridge across the ditch in between the Upper Bailey and the Middle Bailey. This is where our courtyard is. So our small test pits, we had to open up a couple more because we were interested to see what we were finding. And here, for example, we were starting to find evidence of different floor surfaces. So you can see we've got some cobbles in one corner and we've got flagstones further up. But you can see from this that the archaeology is literally just below the tarmac. So we were starting to get evidence of surfaces. We were starting to get evidence of the potential defensive ditch. So this meant that we needed to do a lot more work in this area. On the top left picture, you can see that we've got the Ducal Palace, and this is from the late 18th century, this image. And you can see just to the north of the Ducal Palace, you can see a bit of a drop down, like a box cut into the ground. That is the service courtyard in the 18th century. So we know that it was in use as something, but we couldn't work out what it was. And we know that there would have been surfaces like the flagstones and the cobbles that you can see. But again, we needed to do more work to find out what was going on. So we ended up doing a large excavation in this area in 2018. So you can see from these images that we start to do the work here. Now in this picture, you can see that we have dug trenches, evenly spaced across the dig. Now, the reason why we've done this is because of the way that they were going to build the new attraction experience centre. They were going to drive sheet piles down into the ground at regular intervals. Now, sheet piles are just very large pieces of iron, and this was agreed by the archaeologists and the architects that they could do this because it wouldn't then disturb that much archaeology either side. So when you drive the sheet piles into the ground, they go down 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 meters. It just depends on how long your sheet pile is. And then you concrete the first couple of feet into the ground so that all you're going to disturb is those first couple of feet in some a larger scale. So where these bands are, that's where they're driving the sheet piles. And the reason why we're digging a bit lower there is because that's where the concrete pads are going to secure the sheet piles in place. This means that we had this amazing dig right above a medieval defensive ditch that we know from the boreholes goes down about 8 meters, but we were only allowed to dig a grand total of 84 centimeters down into these trenches. And the remainder of the site, we were only allowed to dig down 44 centimetres because that would have been the depth of the floor of the new centre. So unfortunately, even though we've been allowed to dig in the courtyard area, we were only allowed to dig less than the first metre. And that means we have sealed the next 7 metres of material underneath the building, which is a bit unfortunate. Hopefully one day we'll get back down there to see what's right at the bottom of the defensive ditch. But from the archaeology we did uncover, we do think that all of the material below our feet backfilling the ditch is not going to be much older than, say, 500 years, maybe 600. We don't think we're going to get much information right at the bottom of the ditch to tell us the early days of the castle. And I'll tell you why now by looking at the archaeology we did uncover. So first of all, let's start off with the actual ditch itself. We did actually pick up evidence of the defensive ditch. So if you look at phase 1, you can see that the hasher lines at the top left corner is basically all of the material that sat inside the castle ditch. We then found phase 2 and 3, a pre-palace sunken courtyard. We then found evidence of the first ducal palace courtyard and different layers of ground levelling through phase 5. And in phase 5B in the late 18th century, we did find evidence of robbing out some of the floor surfaces. And then you get into the 18th and 19th centuries, all the way through to the 20th centuries, where we're finding evidence of staircases, drainage, and modern surfaces. So going back to this image to show you the original ditch from the 11th century, where that red line is, you can just see the sandstone. We think that that is the original line of the defensive ditch. So in the 11th century, you've got a team of people. They have dug straight through the solid sandstone bedrock, and it would have been on a trajectory something like that. So you can just see that we have got a little smidgen of sandstone just to the south of the new build that you can see along that red line, and it would have continued straight through. But you can see that we've lost a section of sandstone along that red line, and that is from a later phase and from later works in the area. So we know that we've got the defensive ditch. However, you then move to 1485 reconstruction of the castle, and we know that there were buildings by this point inside the ditch itself. So you can see those from the arrow pointing on the screen. So that's why we don't think that the material that we have covered over with this new building that we weren't able to excavate, we don't think it's going to take us all the way back to the early phases of the castle. We think that at some point they have decided they don't need the defensive ditch anymore, and they have filled it back in and flattened it off and used that area to fill in with other buildings. We're not quite sure what they were used for, but that's what we think has happened. You're actually going all the way through into the early 1600s, and you still seeing evidence that the courtyard is being used for something different other than a defensive purpose. So a guy called Robert Smithson created a plan in 1617. He was also the guy that was associated with Woollerton Hall and the creation of the hall and the gardens. He created a plan of the medieval castle before it was knocked down at the end of the Civil War. And on the plan, you can actually see that the courtyard as it now is has got a set of steps that run down into that sunken area. So it's now no longer a defensive ditch, it's clearly some kind of functional area. And if we zoom in a little bit closer, you can see that the courtyard is filled with these buildings, a small set of swirly steps, and then to the right, this really funny angled set of steps leading down into it from the Middle Bailey. We think that those wonky set of steps is what this red line is here. We think that they've cut into the sandstone to create a solid level base in which to set those steps into, and they lead from the Middle Bailey down into this sunken courtyard. So the defensive ditch, after being filled in, the sandstone is then cut away and a new set staircase has been put in. You've got to realise that the tunnel, the way that we enter the site today, is actually a modern addition. So people wouldn't have accessed this sunken courtyard through a tunnel, they would have accessed it from the Middle Bailey down a set of steps, and we think that's where that red line is now. The blue box indicates the earliest floor surface that we found to the depth that we were allowed to dig, and it has impressions of tiles in it. So it's just a mortar floor, but it would have had tiles impressed into it. And we think that that surface is from the medieval castle from around the early 17th century and associated with this staircase. So at this point, it's obviously a space that's utilised for some reason, but we're not quite sure what it was used for at that point. This picture shows that the staircase would have actually had underfloor storage, under stairs storage, like a pantry. Where these stones are, they have been used to block up a doorway. So at some point there would have been a doorway leading into an undercroft under that set of stairs that you can see on the Smithson plan of 1617. So was the site used for storage? Was it used to hang carcasses from hunts or something like that? We're not quite sure at that point. So later on, we know that they have laid floor surfaces on top of the floor surface I showed you on a couple of slides ago. What we think is happening is by the 17th and 18th centuries, all of the material that they've put into the ditch is starting to sink. So floor surfaces and any buildings on this area are starting to subside. So then they are having to build more layers of material up and relay new floor surfaces. So by the time these floor surfaces marked in blue and the red lines, which are some kind of drainage system, go in, we think that they've had to build the surfaces up quite a lot over and over again over a period of years because of the subsidence. So we're thinking now that at this point in around the time of the Ducal Palace, so now we're into the late 17th century, that they are utilising the site as maybe like a bit of a stable block or some kind of kitchen area where you're starting to work with carcasses. Maybe you're hanging the carcasses somewhere from a hunt, because these drains must have been used to drain away some sort of fluid. So it's either going to be fecal matter or it's going to be blood if they're draining carcasses, things like that. Because by this point, during the phase of the Ducal Palace, the doorway that you can see on your right, so not the arrows, but the doorway on your right, that would have led into the kitchens. So this open air courtyard may have been used to sort out any carcasses that they may have caught on a hunt and then take them straight into the kitchen. Or maybe this is where they would have got deliveries of food from the town and then it would have gone straight into the kitchen. It's possibility. A little later addition into the 19th century is this red line at the bottom of the screen. This is actually a later staircase, and the arrow is actually pointing to where the staircase would have led up to the Middle Bailey. We think this is something to do with when the palace was split into apartments. So it's possible that the lower apartment, which used to be Ducal Palace kitchens and then was split up in the late 18th century, that this is how you would have accessed it. You would have come up to the Middle Bailey, gone down this set of steps and through the doorway on the right. So the courtyard, as it is known today, we think is a modern name, but actually we think that it has always been used as some kind of a courtyard, whether it's to store any sort of foodstuffs, to get out of the site on a hunt, or for just receiving servants and other visitors that shouldn't really be going through the main doors. So even though we're only going down 8 centimetres, we did find out quite a lot of information. We also did a little bit of work through those double doors on the right of that picture and found evidence of Ducal Palace walls, but also other potential medieval masonry, but also some Victorian additions. We're not quite sure if some of the work that some of the stonework we did find was something to do with the actual drawbridge that would have gone across from the Middle Bailey to the Upper Bailey. So the plan at the bottom, the little blue box, is what you can see on the right in the right-hand picture. It's a large pillar of stone, and it's possible that this is something to do with that original stone bridge that Henry II would have probably built, replaced a wooden drawbridge with, and it would have led from the Middle Bailey to the Upper Bailey. So it's quite exciting to think that we might have found some of the earlier remnants of the original castle just underneath the floor of the Ducal Palace kitchens. And you can see from this picture just how shallow all the archaeology actually is. Yeah, it's literally 20 centimeters below the floor. So it's probably lucky that the Ducal Palace was built where it was, because it has actually saved some of the archaeology. Some of the finds, some really nice bits of pottery from there, some slipware in the bottom corner, a bit of a Bellarmine jug on the top right, a nice blackware jug on the bottom left. But the top left is one of the most interesting finds. It's a little whistle, and it's actually made from a bone from a goose's wing, so a goose ulna. We have a bone specialist at Trenton Peak, and he is very, very knowledgeable, and he can literally pick bones up and tell you what they are. And he knew pretty quickly, that it was a bird's bone. He just needed to work out what species of bird it was. And we're not quite sure what the whistle might have been used for, but if the courtyard was used to store carcasses, and maybe that's where hunts went out from into the forests that would have surrounded Nottingham at the time, is it potentially a hunting whistle? We don't really know. But one of the most interesting finds of that particular bit of the dig was a few bones that for a few minutes worried us, because we thought they were human, but we actually discovered that they were monkey bones. And these bones were found in one of the pits that was dug through some of the floor surfaces. What we think has happened is, at some point during the period of where the Ducal Palace is being changed into apartments, they are digging out some of the old floor surfaces using those stones, flagstones, in other parts of the Ducal Palace. But in these pits, in these robber pits, they are dumping a load of rubbish. And in one of these pits were the remains of these monkeys. Now, believe it or not, there is actually somewhere in Sheffield that has drawers and drawers and drawers of monkey and ape skeletons. So our bone specialist was very excited and got the chance to go up to Sheffield and have these monkey and ape bones to try and work out what species they were. And we couldn't quite determine exactly the species, but it could be some kind of a macaque, something like that. Somewhere in between, a species from West or Central Africa. And we're not quite sure who had the monkeys, but we do know that there was a lady who used to live in one of the Ducal Palace apartments until around 1825. Her name was Miss Kirby, and she was a bit flamboyant, and she did throw lots of parties, and she did have quite a menagerie of animals. She was supposed to have had a golden eagle, she was supposed to have had peacocks, lapdogs, but also we think she may have kept these monkeys as pets. The sad thing is that one of the monkeys was found to have rickets, and another one was found to have had traces of malaria. So these monkeys weren't the best kept monkeys and weren't the healthiest. We also did a little bit of work around the gatehouse. We were looking for evidence of the drawbridge. You can see evidence of the stone bridge on the side where the Robin Hood statue is, but you don't really know where it is on the other side because it's all cobbled over. A couple of images here of what the gatehouse used to look like and what it looks like now. So it's changed a lot in the past few hundred years. But our excavations did start to reveal the other side of the bridge. The plan was to restore the other side of the bridge, so you could actually walk up to the main castle gatehouse and walk along the bridge. Whether they've done that or not now, I'm not quite sure. But we did find the original gatehouse bridge. We also found evidence that the bridge itself, after the castle was slighted at the end of the Civil War, that they also damaged the drawbridge. We did actually find evidence that the drawbridge was fixed during William Cavendish's ownership of the palace. So he actually utilised some of the stonework from the original medieval castle to fix patches and holes in the bridge itself. So this image shows a piece of stone, probably from a window or a door of the medieval castle, being used to fill in a gap on the bridge leading up to the gatehouse. So that was quite interesting. But the other main excavation was the visitor centre. Now, moving back to the visitor centre, you can see it here. This is what the site was looking like when we first started. Now, you may recall what I said to you about the courtyard excavations and the way that we had to dig those. We had to dig them in a way, the same way again, where they were going to sheet pile straight through the site. So you can just see the trenches back on this picture here. This is where they were going to drive the sheet pile straight through. So we had to dig it the same way by digging these trenches where the sheet piles and the concrete was going to be poured. And then we were allowed to dig level the rest of the site down to around 50 centimetres again. So it wasn't very deep, but it was still what we hoped was going to be quite interesting. The reason why we were digging at this particular point was because of what we found with the boreholes. Now, one of the boreholes in particular was very interesting. We managed to get down to about 8 to 9 metres with one of the boreholes in this particular area of where the visitor centre was going to go. And doing a radiocarbon date on some of the lowest deposits picked up a date of 1000 before present, so around 1000 AD, maybe even a little bit earlier. Now, this would suggest that somebody was up on top of Castle Rock before the castle was built. Now, because as I mentioned earlier, we haven't really got any evidence of Anglo-Saxons living on Castle Rock, this was quite exciting. So because we thought we may have found evidence of Anglo-Saxons on top of the hill, we dug a big hole. We dug a big hole down to try and get down to the level where we found this radiocarbon date evidence of Anglo-Saxons, potentially. So you can see we've sheet piled all the way around this big hole. We've dug a big hole. We dropped a couple of archaeologists in it. And then we continued the same method of digging the trenches where the sheet piles were going to go to try and establish if we did have a buried Anglo-Saxon land surface that could then once and for all tell us if people were up on the rock before the Normans built their castle. However, you may notice from this section photograph that the material doesn't look right. If it was nicely built up layers of material, those layers would be striated horizontally, maybe with a slight slope, because Castle Rock is one big slope in effect. However, in this picture, the material is very mixed and it's all sloping very steeply in one direction. And the worst bit was we've already gone down about 5 meters by this point, and we were still only finding 17th century and 18th century pottery, bone, tile, that kind of stuff. So how could we go so deep and still only have post-medieval material coming out? It was very confusing until we saw this picture. Now, this picture is drawn from around the 18th century, and it shows the ducal palace on the hill, it shows the gardens, it shows the ruined gatehouse, and it shows the curtain wall. Now, the curtain wall doesn't look unusual at the moment until you look at that particular spot there. It looks completely different. We think that this is where, at the end of the Civil War, the curtain wall was slighted. It was completely smashed to bits at that particular spot. The ducal palace has then been built, and the Duke and his family have then gone around the gardens and the Outer Bailey and fixed areas that needed fixing. the curtain wall being one of the main areas that needed sorting out because it was a mess where it's been slighted. They've obviously filled in the gap, filled in the wall, and then any material that had fallen out from behind the curtain wall, they've then filled back in at that point and levelled it all off. Guess where our dig was? Our excavations of the visitor centre were right behind where we think this gap in the wall used to be. So if the gap in the wall has been caused by a large cannon and it's exploded and all of the material has fallen out at that particular point, the Duke has then come along, filled that hole in and filled the material back in behind it from anywhere he could find, anywhere he could get his hands on a load of material. And we think that that's why, after digging 5 meters down, we were still finding pottery and archaeology dating from around the time of the ducal palace being built. Which means that we're not quite sure where this piece of charcoal came from that we managed to radiocarbon date to the Anglo-Saxon period. We're not quite sure where it came from at all. But obviously, if the Duke has been throwing any old material in the gap in between the curtain wall, behind the curtain wall, it could have come from anywhere. So unfortunately, our excavations of the visitor centre didn't prove anything at all, which is the nature of archaeology, unfortunately. That is what the visitor centre last looked like when we eventually left it. So yeah, take from that what you will. It looks like a bit of a bomb site as it is there. I'm sure it's not as bad. I have not personally been in there at the moment since it's been done. It just looks a bit odd with the really nice gatehouse. But I'll leave it up to you to decide. Now, very quickly going to whiz through a couple of other things that we did. During the groundworks, so we did large excavations, but we also then had to do smaller works where they were putting in new electric cables, new gas, that kind of stuff. So in the Outer Bailey, in the Middle Bailey, we did a lot of groundworks. We worked on the ditches, this defensive ditches. So from here, from this picture on the left, you can see all of the backfilled material all the way down into the main ditch, the defensive ditch running around the outside of the middle Bailey. So that's all the really dark material at the bottom of the screen. You can also see evidence here that they've put through the sandstone bedrock again, potentially to put in some kind of a drawbridge. So going back to the earliest reconstruction of the 11th century castle, you can just see it there, the drawbridge running through the middle of the ditch between the Upper Bailey and the Middle Bailey. But you can also see another drawbridge just behind the wooden tower of the Middle Bailey. That's the drawbridge that we think we've got evidence for here in the bottom left corner. They've cut into the sandstone bedrock to create a really solid flat foundation to build a wooden drawbridge up. What's now in the ditch is a kid's climbing frame of some sort. It's sort of more of like an aerial climbing frame thing. I'm not quite sure. I've not seen it. We've also had, during our excavations, evidence of the Ducal Palace's carriageway. So the picture on the right is a drawing from around the mid to late 17th century, and you can see that the Duke would have had his carriages brought up onto the Middle Bailey, and then he would have probably driven round to the back of the Ducal Palace to then get out of his carriage and go into the Ducal Palace from there. So in the bottom left corner, you can see evidence of the carriageway's makeup. So on this one, you can see the ramp wall, and you can see all of the infill that would have been used to build up that carriageway. It just goes to show you, though, this picture, the different levels of the archaeology. This is a carriageway from the 18th century, 17th century, and it's easily a metre down, and yet we found evidence of the medieval castle less than 20 centimetres below some of the Ducal Palace floor surfaces. So it's all a bit all over the place, the archaeology. We also had some work in the Middle Bailey around where the Great Chapel used to be, and we did find evidence of burials and also remains of the great chapel itself. So in the bottom left picture, you can just see the remains of a skeleton's legs there. And we've also got on the bottom right-hand corner, potential evidence for the great chapel there, built out of stone. During the excavations in the 1970s, when they were doing works to uncover Richard III's tower, they did actually do a little bit of work in the Middle Bailey, and they did actually find in 1978 the remains, or half of the remains, of a young adult, who at the time they thought was something to do with the Civil War, maybe a Civil War captain. Now, if you were buried in the chapel at the Middle Bailey of a castle, you're going to be quite important, which is why they assumed he was probably something to do with the Civil War. However, we did a bit more work on the same area during the works we did for putting electrical cables through the grounds, and we found the other half of this skeleton, and we actually managed to date a person more likely to the between the 1400s and 1550s. So we're assuming that it wasn't a Civil War casualty, but they were clearly buried in the grounds of the Great Chapel. So it's obviously somebody of status. Now, the castle wasn't obviously lived in by kings or queens for most of the time, but they would have had custodians. And these custodians would have been quite wealthy themselves and quite important people. So it might be that the remains of this skeleton here were the remains of somebody who looked after the castle as it was back in the 16th and 17th centuries. With some more services going through the Upper Bailey and out through the gatehouse, we did actually find remains of Richard III's state apartments. So you can just see from the very narrow excavations, the stonework popping up there, and they would have been the foundations of a wooden structure that would have formed Richard III's apartments. And they are in the little blue circle on the left of the screen. Working through even further, more evidence of the state apartments, and as you can see, it is literally just small snippets of stonework. So when it comes to doing works like this, all you can do is work within the parameters that the services are going to disturb. So gas, electric, water. If there's anything going beyond the excavations, we can't chase it. We can't follow it. We have to just stick with what they are going to disturb. So that's why our excavations during the service laying, you could only get snippets of information about what was happening in the Middle Bailey during the 15th and 16th centuries. You just have to sort of piece it together like a bit of a jigsaw puzzle, that's all. But it is a bit frustrating sometimes when you can only dig certain areas. So here's Richard III's state apartments on this picture again. You can just make them out. They would have had lovely bay windows, lots of glass, lots of light, a lot more modern at that point than living in the Upper Bailey, which was quite drafty and cold because it was all stone built by Henry II 200, 300 years earlier. So that's why Richard built a whole new suite of apartments to make them more comfortable. Again, during our narrow excavations of the service trenches, we found evidence of cesspits. Also, there's a well on that right-hand picture. We also found material relating to the Middle Bailey Chapel, but again, just snippets of that material. It's the chapel that's believed to be the oldest stone building on the site, alongside the curtain wall. And we also found evidence of the curtain wall itself. So that's in the right-hand picture. You can just see, it's a little bit blurry, but you can just see it seems quite flat in the bottom of this trench, and then all of a sudden it drops away. We think that is remains of the curtain wall itself. So that would be that just there, because that bit that you just saw on that picture is around the back side of the Ducal Palace. So it's quite exciting that we're starting to pick up evidence of the curtain wall as well. And you can see it even clearer in the trenches leading further round the Upper Bailey. In the picture on the right, you can actually see the rubble core of the curtain wall. So the curtain wall would have had really nice faced stone on the front and on the back. And then the centre of it would have just been infilled with lumps of stone and rock, and it would have just been a bit of a mishmash, just to make it quite thick and quite solid. And that's what you can see on that right-hand picture there. There was also some renovation work, so they did a lot of the Ducal Palace itself, cleaned it up. They also did some work around the bandstand, and these renovation works actually uncovered some early foundations and early drains associated with the Ducal Palace dating to the 17th century. And they also found later 19th century tiled floors. Unfortunately, these lovely tiled floors are covered over. They didn't want to leave them out on display, which is fair enough, because obviously they could get damaged, but it's also quite sad to think that we couldn't see them, and we're not going to see them either. I'm not sure how much time I've got left, but we did also do some work with some students during the works at the castle, and we called it We Dig the Castle, and we just did a little bit of work around the bandstand. During 2015 to 2017, we did open up quite a large area, and we uncovered some really weird features. We're not quite sure what they are, but we're thinking they're something to do with the allotments that would have been associated with the Ducal Palace in the 19th century. So once the palace has been burnt down and the gardens are turned into allotments, you start to get these really weird shapes that are cut into the natural sand. And we think that they would have been something to do with growing vegetables, because you can see they're all quite, you have got some symmetrical features running through the site there. They're all very odd. Long troughs, maybe for vegetables. Although English Heritage thought that it might be for licorice. And the reason why they thought it was licorice cultivation was because the Duke liked licorice. I don't think that's the greatest reason for assuming something, is that somebody liked licorice. So we think they're growing licorice. We also thought that maybe it was a Civil War gun emplacement, where they would have had to build a wooden structure to prop cannon onto, but we're not entirely sure that that's true either. The reason why we've had a thought it might be a gun emplacement is because during the Civil War, the Cavaliers are supposed to have taken over St. Nicholas's Church and put a cannon at the top of St. Nick's Church and fired into the castle from that point. So obviously, if you're getting fired at, you're going to want to fire back. So it might have been that they built this platform. But since then, we've decided that it must be allotment features. And you can see from this colour-coded chart, all of the different features, how they seem to be in order. You've got sets of troughs that all seem to be nice and symmetrical to the right of the picture, that are sort of the plum colour. And then you have a lighter purple, long troughs running in one direction, maybe for growing potatoes or some other root vegetable, and then other features as well. It's just a crisscross, a mishmash of allotment features. We did find a lot of medieval pottery and a few coins. We think that all of this medieval pottery, though, has been churned up because none of the features themselves were medieval. So we think that the medieval material has come in from a different place on the castle site. We found a lot of clay pipes. We also found some lead shot. And we also found a lovely trade token of some sort. We thought we found the remains of an allotment building, which we thought might have been this building here with the blue arrow. But on a bit more research, and also finding these weird chalk-looking things that are called carbon arc rods, we actually discovered that it was hard standing surface for searchlights. During the Second World War, there was actually searchlights set up on the site of the castle, but they would have been on the back of a truck. They would have been moved about. So we think that the brick remains that we did find were actually just a hard surface for a truck to set itself on to set up searchlights, because carbon arc rods are used in searchlights. We did actually think we find the remains of an allotment building below the hard standing surface, which is that little square structure that you can see there. Very crudely made, which is why we think it's probably a part of an allotment structure. So in conclusion, We did find a lot of interesting archaeology, which we're hoping that they're going to at some point display at the castle. There is plenty there for public interpretation, so we're hoping they're going to put up some lovely interpretation panels. We're hoping to do a little bit more training and community excavations, and it just helps to define the castle a little bit more and help to interpret it for the future, and maybe we can do a bit more work in the future to uncover a bit more about the courtyard, for example, and the allotments themselves, because the allotments were quite interesting, and it would be nice to try and find evidence of the people that were using the allotments as well. So I know that was a bit of a mad dash through the history of the castle and all of the stuff that we have done, but we have done quite a lot. So if anybody has any questions, I'm sorry if I've waffled along too long, but there is obviously a lot to cover there. So hopefully it was quite interesting for you.